Hello, welcome to The Rest is History. This is the second part of a two-part series on the history of Silicon Valley, the development of the internet, the role it plays in the kind of broadest historical spectrum, and we're incredibly privileged to have as our guest absolute titan of the internet, Marc Andreessen, developer of the web browser, one of the profoundest thinkers and investors in this field.
And the first billionaire to have ever appeared on The Rest is History.
Yes, Dominic, you're obsessed with.
I am. I'm
above that.
I've never spoken to somebody who's as rich. I mean, just so colossally rich, but also such a. I mean, he'll be remembered when, the man who popularized the web browser is much more important than any number of prime ministers.
I'm not denying that, but I'm just above worrying about wealth. I guess
I know.
A nobler and better person than you.
I know, anyway, listeners, that what an utter lie that is.
Let's move on. So in the previous episode, we were discussing social media.
Yes, we've just come to it, hadn't we?
We've come to
Facebook.
that. So Facebook has basically been invented. Marc Andreessen is on the board of Facebook today. He's investor in Twitter, all kinds of things like that as well. So a guy who knows infinitely more about it.
But no one knows more about Twitter than you, Tom. I mean, you tweet more than about the rest of the population put together, don't you? You and the other Tom Holland.
Yeah, but I'm the user. He's the supplier.
Right. Yeah.
And it's the supplier knows more than
nothing
the user.
Makes my day more than when you get birthday wishes or just a tweet asking for an autograph or something from a teenage girl in Tuscaloosa, because I know how much it annoys you.
No, I always enjoy it. It's hilarious. The one thing that really annoys me is people who think that I've never heard a joke about my name being the same name as the guy who plays Spider-Man.
Yeah. That's the great thing about it. You see, that's the joke that never stops giving.
It was quite funny in kind of 47 AD.
Right. We've got Marc Andreessen, or we had Marc Andreessen rather. We spoke to him, and we should bring him on, shouldn't we? We should just stop wittering to each other. We started by asking Marc about what I see as a tension at the heart of social media. So on the one hand, social media is supposed to be a great collective endeavor, bringing people together and uniting people across the world. This is part of Facebook's entire ethos, of course. But at the same time, it's something that you do on your own. And there's always a tendency to kind of retreat, as I see it, into silos or bubbles of like-minded people and to kind of screen out the rest of the world. So we asked him about that and whether he thinks that social media really does bring the world together.
Well, so, let's take on the sort of filter bubble or the silo thing right up front. And I know you guys, I listened to your Coffee House podcast last night, and you guys talked about this a little bit. But, there has been this criticism of the internet kind of the whole time. And I think by the way, there is some truth to it, right? And the criticism is this kind of they call the filter bubble criticism, which basically is the internet lets you, good news, bad news. The internet lets you find people who are exactly like you, right? So whatever thing you're into, whatever, hobby you have, whatever interest you have, whatever politics you have, whatever religion you have, like, it doesn't matter, up until the internet, like, if you did not grow up around people who shared that interest, you didn't have anybody to talk to who shared that interest. And with the internet, all of a sudden, you can go find people who just happen to correspond exactly to your preconceptions. And that could be a really wonderful thing. And that can also be, the argument goes a really terrible thing, right? Because it echo chambers, reinforces, maybe this sort of cult-like behavior, that you do see. I think there's a truth to that, but I think there's also another truth, and the research on filter bubbles actually has demonstrated this other truth. The other truth is the internet also makes it much more likely you're going to encounter people who disagree, right? So, like, a lot of people in real life, as we say, IRL, in real life, a lot of people in real life, and this is sort of, let's say this is like characteristic, for example, of a lot of highly educated people. Right. A lot of highly educated people grow up in these college towns, right? And their parents are like college professors or something, or professionals of some kind. And they grow up in these sort of relatively kind of insulated environments where everybody around them is like highly educated and, kind of middle class, upper middle class, and often from, a relatively narrow, kind of selection of nationalities or ethnic groups. And, and they basically in real life, they're only talking to people who are like themselves. And then, and by the way, the same thing's true of rural America. The same thing's true of urban America, right? It's the same thing's true of, lots of places around the world. People grow up in these kind of real world filter bubbles. And then you go on the internet and it's like you get slammed into this kaleidoscope of lots of people who believe lots of other things, right? And so all of a sudden, for the first time, like you can't retreat anymore. Like you actually can't retreat. It's the opposite, right? You're getting kind of shoved into this much more, cacophonous, should I say, diverse fragmented, superheated, tons of arguments. Why do people get sucked into arguing online, right? There's a famous cartoon, which is, sorry, honey, I can't come to bed right now. Somebody is wrong on the internet. Right? Like, why do people get sucked into arguing online, right? Which has become kind of the national or the global hobby. It's because like there are people, you just are slammed into people who really don't agree with you. And so I think that is the other side of it.
So on the coffee shop analogy, the development of the printing press, the growth of literacy, the ability of people to read stuff that previously they hadn't been able to read. People then are able to kind of find people like them, but also they're able to find things that they really disagree with, and it has a transformative effect on the fabric and the culture of 17th, 18th century life. Do you think that the internet is having a kind of analogous effect, that it's amplifying the way in which people both agree and disagree with one another in ways that it's kind of having a direct impact on politics in the US, Europe, whatever?
Yeah, and in fact, I think I would. And again, it took me a long time to come to grips with this, both because it's complicated and also because as a Midwesterner, it's hard for me to talk too dramatically about work I'm involved in. But I think it's hard to argue any other thesis than what you just stated. And I take it a step further, which is I think the internet brings a level of intensity to consuming information, to communicating with other people, to having arguments, to being a part of a movement, to being a part of a scene, to feeling like you're a part of history, to feeling, like you're, fully connected to the kind of the flow of politics and to cultural and social changes. The level of intensity the internet provides, it seems to me, is just way beyond anything previous, right? Like, you just like the rush of what happens when you get wrapped into these things online is just so far beyond the experience that, it's so striking, right? To kind of think about the history. Can you, if you guys can you visualize what it would have been like to be part of the first generation that learned how to read, and then had access to a book, right? And and obviously people got like very enthusiastic about the Bible, right? Like they went off on wars and like all this stuff to follow, and so clearly they had this very high level of animating passion. But like in our time, right, it's hard to imagine anybody getting that fired up about a book. But boy, are they getting fired up online. I think it's the right. I'll stop.
But sorry if I can jump in, Mark. But to go back to combine the point you just made with Tom's previous point about the printing press. So in the first sort of decades after the invention of the printing press, you have this explosion of print culture and colossal consequences. I mean, the Protestant Reformation and so on. So the new technology goes hand in hand with an intensity that then drives political change. Do you think that the intense politics of the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, so in America, the obvious example is the rise and fall of Donald Trump. I mean, that wouldn't have been possible without the internet, without social media, right? I mean, he used Twitter to communicate, and his opponents used social media to kind of whip themselves into a frenzy of outrage at every new thing that he did. I mean, so the internet, it's not just that it creates a particular kind of politics, a very sort of assertive, maybe aggressive, strident politics, doesn't it?
Well, so I sort of half agree. And the reason I half agree, of course, is because Trump is far from the first populist, right?
Right. Agreed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because before Trump, you had, when I was younger, Ross Perot like almost won the presidency, right? He was a very Trump-like figure. Before that, obviously, you had, Huey Long, right? William Jennings Bryan. And then of course, talking about populists, right? You had, your Hitlers and your Mussolinis, right? It's everybody's like, oh my God, the internet's responsible for the rise of fascism, right? And in the modern world, and it's like, well, we actually had fascism like 70, 80 years ago, that Hitler fellow, say what you will, like he didn't have access to the internet, so somehow he figured out a way to do it with,
But he's always on the internet now, isn't he? He's always on the internet.
Yeah. God, you guys say God wins law. There's actually a law of the internet that says, yes, every discussion inevitably becomes a discussion about Hitler. So it's like basically it's like there is no like in a sense there's nothing new kind of about the politics of our era, and I would even say that in maybe a sort of a disappointing way, which is it feels at least to me like we're kind of rehashing kind of old and settled, debates and arguments from, whether 30 years ago or 70 years ago or 100 years ago. And so therefore establishing causation is hard. And so I guess the way I would put it is like, I don't know that the internet, I don't think the internet, for sure, the internet didn't cause populism. Or by the way, the same thing, right? The resurgence of this, kind of more, let's say, primal kind of leftism, at the same time, which is sort of, you can kind of see in both, kind of wokeness on the one hand, but also kind of this re-rise of socialism, on the other hand, right? So the corresponding kind of, thing is happening on the left. But again, it's like, identity politics are not new with the internet. They were a big deal in the 1960s pre the internet. And of course, ethnic and racial division is not new. It's very old. And then, socialism is not new, right? And, again, the socialism, the Russian Revolution, happened on the basis of what, like the mimeograph machine. And, in-person organizing. So, do these technologies create these things? I don't think so. On the other hand, I think there's at least my model is basically the technology of the time it's the conduit for these things. And then it's, you might say the amplifier, or, the organizing, kind of agent. And so, if the Nazi Party, for example, was a consequence of, radio, and the Russian Revolution was a consequence of mimeograph machines, like, again, those are very primal ideas, but they flowed through the technology of that time. And now we have this, well, then you could argue the other side of that, which is, now we have this sort of, I would argue, kind of much more, or say even more visceral form of technology. That's even more present in people's lives, that's even more powerful than the ones that came before. And so maybe it's old ideas, but being expressed in new ways and leading to different consequences. By the way, let me add one other theory, right? Which is, whenever you had, like, at least my understanding of history is like, before the internet, if you had like basically a mass political movement, right, it was characterized by street activity, right? Like you'd have, fights and riots, and, you'd have like, bloodshed, people getting killed, big public strikes and protests and all these things. And of course, we do have, from time to time, we have activity in the streets, in the US. But like, there's another argument basically, which is the internet is a substitution for real world activity, right? And so there's a more benign kind of projection here, which is maybe the internet greatly inflames politics and gets everybody all heated up, but maybe people are basically too busy pounding away at their keyboards to go out into the streets.
Yeah. Though, of course, something like the Arab Spring, I mean, that's a good example of something where the internet did get people out in the streets, didn't it? I mean,
yeah, that's right. And in fact, one of the things that repressive political regimes learned from the Arab Spring, and which they grapple with today when these things happen, which is, okay, what happens when there's like mass political movement online and where you even have real world protests being organized online? If you're a repressive political regime, the very first thing you think of is, I'm going to shut off that internet, right? I'm going to kill the switch. And of course, that is the guaranteed way now to get everybody in the street.
Or Mark, I mean, looking at the Taliban, they're on Twitter, and it wouldn't surprise me to, they'll give us their preferred pronouns. It's they're on Twitter, whereas Donald Trump isn't. And in a sense, perhaps the go-getting totalitarian, you get on social media and you kind of
you manicure your message, right?
Manicure the message. You could, yeah. I mean,
I saw a meme the other day. Is the Taliban would like you to know that their preferred pronouns are he, him.
Right. I don't think there's much doubt about that. So that the internet could be.
Then there's this other question, right, which flows from what you just said, which is basically, to what extent is the internet actually yes, the internet may to some extent drive division and so forth, but maybe the sort of broader impact of the internet is that it's a giant assimilation machine, right? And it's a giant assimilation machine into Western culture broadly defined. Right, and it's the Joseph Henrich, weird, kind of weird, kind of concept, which is, maybe the internet, and again, this is sort of like if you were a traditionalist, you would basically say the internet, basically, basically, if you're a traditionalist, you'd say modern media and modern culture for the last decades and centuries has always, has been ripping people out of their historical cultures, for a long time now. But the internet will complete that process. Like the internet is just going to rip every kid out of whatever the local culture is.
Well, that's
right.
That you mentioned wokeness. Wokeness is we often have a little segue into discussions of wokeness in this podcast. And obviously, there's an argument in Britain, for example, that a lot of the argument about the kind of woke culture here is an Americanization of our own kind of national culture. That basically, because of so many people are on social media, so many opinion formers, they look at what's happening in the States and they just import it. Do you think to To what extent do you think the internet, I mean, in some ways, because you are a Midwesterner and everything, you're completely the wrong person to ask. But to what extent is the kind of internet and social, to what extent are they massive engines of Americanization, do you think?
So I think that's the case, and this can easily sound triumphalist, which is not kind of how I intended. In fact, I think there might be real significant downsides to this, but I think there's a very powerful argument to be made. Well, look, it's the same argument people have been making about Hollywood forever, right? Which is sort of Clint Eastwood. There's an argument used to be made about Hollywood, which is, Clint Eastwood kind of defined a sort of image of masculinity that went global, right? And so you've got kids all over the world in the 1960s, 1970s who were like, aha, that's what I want to be like, right? And so this is an older idea, but yeah, the internet, again, it's so visceral. It pulls you in like so dramatically. It's such an intense experience. There's a language component to it, right? Which is, the internet is overwhelmingly English language.
And so it must be entrenching the status of English as the global lingua franca, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I'll just tell you, here's a phenomenon we now routinely see, which we didn't see before. So the newly arrived entrepreneurs, the global entrepreneurs coming from all over the world to come to Silicon Valley that are in their early 20s now, they show up here. They don't have accents. They speak completely fluent American English. And I always ask, like, how did you get so good at English? And it's like, well, they said, and they look at me like I'm puzzled, and they're like, YouTube, right? Like, yeah. Right. And so, so there's a language component. Obviously, language itself is a culture carrier, as the French will tell you. And then there's just all of the other components to go. I mean, no, there's the really fundamental things, which is just like, the basic idea of uncontrolled flow of information, right? Is something that comes with the internet that, that people are, freak out about all the time. But like that, of course, is a very Western, kind of thing. And, it's very specifically like, an American thing with freedom of speech as a sort of a primary thing. And then, there's, just all of the attitudes. There's this debate online a while ago that I found really interesting. So Brian Kaplan, the economist, basically said, basically he called Western civilization. He said, everybody's always worried about kind of Western civilization getting buried, and he said, he called it the hardy weed. And he basically made this argument that Western civilization is kind of going to spread and eat everything. And then Scott Alexander basically argued it's not Western civilization, it's universal civilization, because it's Western civilization, but incorporating all of the best elements of everybody else's culture, right? And so just as an example, Japanese anime has gone global on the internet, right? And it's sort of like Korean Japanese pop. Anime has been kind of embraced into kind of the Western conception of entertainment and media in a way that it wasn't before the internet. And so Scott would say it's going to be everybody's culture kind of munched together. The positive view is it's going to be everybody's culture kind of munched together, including the best of everybody's culture. And that's maybe the most utopian view.
Well, we're all in favour of utopian views, and I think that that would actually be a perfect note to go to a break. So we will see you back after the break. Hello, welcome back to The Rest is History. We are talking the internet as one of the great revolutionary forces in world history, and we are with Mark Andreessen, who, Mark, you wrote a famous essay, how software is eating the world. And I guess, there's almost something there perhaps of Marx, who said of capitalism, famously, that all that is solid melts into air, the way that it kind of has this ability to transform and devour everything traditional, everything solid. Do you think, is that a reasonable way to describe the impact of the internet, the way that software has given us Netflix rather than Blockbuster, it's given us Amazon rather than Borders?
So I think that's true. But then there's also a deeper thing, which is what I tried to get to in the original Software Eats the World essay, which is the internet is viewed through a technological lens. The internet is a carrier of software. And we kind of take software a little bit for granted now because, everybody uses software and everybody knows what an app is and so forth. And so it kind of seems like it's obvious what software is, but like there's a deep truth to software, which I think maybe is still underestimated, which basically, and this is kind of what got me interested in all this stuff when I was a kid to start with, is this software is like as close to magic as you can get in the real world. And I often specifically use the metaphor of alchemy, right? Which is software, so it's like, famously with alchemy, it was the search for the, whatever it was called, the magic formula that would, right, that would philosopher's stone that would turn something that was abundant, lead, into something that was rare and valuable, gold. Well, software basically is the philosopher's stone for turning, quite literally typing on a keyboard right, into changes in the real world, right? So like, what's the easiest thing in the world to do is to sit and type on a keyboard, and what's the hardest thing in the world to do is like, elect a new elect a new president, right? Or like, create a new like global business, or like, convince all these cars to all of a sudden be picking up riders, or convince people to open up their homes and take in people to be able to stay in their homes. References to like Uber and Airbnb. Right. Or by the way, even software to get everybody to kind of realize that their friends are all online and connected, and then they can talk to all their friends in the form of Facebook. And so it's basically like in every one of these things, every time software is used to do anything, somebody has sat at a keyboard, somebody has typed in these sort of magical incantations, right, in this kind of weird sorcery language, right? And then at some point they press enter, and then the real world changes. Right, things change. The car starts to drive itself. Right, really, really amazing changes actually happen in the real world. And so it's this lever, right? It's this giant lever where if you want to change something in the real world, like the easiest and most powerful way to do it now is to write software. And I would say like that fact is like, that's the dominant fact of my basically entire life. But my entire career as a venture capitalist, this is what all of our companies do. Almost all of the really great entrepreneurial kids in the world now are motivated to start this kind of business, to do this kind of thing. And so this is probably still a greatly underestimated factor. It's like software is sort of still visualized by a lot of people as like a separate computer thing, and it's really not that anymore. It's like woven into basically all of reality at this point.
Yeah, but Mark, that has consequences. I mean, for good and ill, right? I mean, if I terminate this conversation now and go and walk down the street, in 5 minutes I'll be in a high street, what you would call Main Street, and it's full of, let's say, storefronts that are unoccupied, and there are, I mean, around the world, if this revolution speeds up and if AI has the effect that people think it will, that's going to cause colossal political, and that's going to pose these immense political and economic challenges, isn't it? For not just for us, but for our successors and for their successors and so on.
Well, so massive change for sure. No question. You often at this point in these conversations, you get to like these sort of dystopian, kind of economic projections where people, the classic one is, well, new technology will lead to mass unemployment, right? Because if we have software doing all these things, then what will the people do? If you put your economist hat on, you basically say that's not what happens, right? And the reason that's not what happens, the technology never leads to mass unemployment, and the reason, of course, is because what technology represents is an increase in productivity, right? In economic terms, right? The technology is a way to do more with less. Yeah. When you do more with less, you increase societal wealth, right? As you increase societal wealth, you actually increase consumer demand. You increase consumer spending power, right? You quite literally create new demand. You create new ability for people to be able to pay for and afford things, and then new industries, new fields, new activities get created that ends up soaking up all the labor. Right?
Do you think the experience of the pandemic has been an illustration of that the economic devastation has been much less than people thought it would be?
Yeah, well, there were two parts. So there were two parts to this that's so striking. And so basically, so two things. So one is, basically from like 2010 to 2019, at least the American press was absolutely full of, I would say, outright Luddite, theories. It was all this. It was this just nonstop drumbeat of like the internet's going to destroy all the jobs and robots are going to, whatever, and nobody's going to have anything to do, and it's going to be this dystopian thing. And then basically what happened was up to January 2020, when COVID first appeared. In January 2020, the American economy, right after 250 years of like furiously, onrushing technological change, including the full impact of the internet and software and all the stuff that was happening up until January 2020, right, resulted in the best consumer economy and the best employment economy in the history of the United States, right? So in January of 2020, unemployment in the U.S. was at all-time lows. Unemployment among the lowest skilled and educated in the U.S. was at all-time lows. Incomes were at all-time highs. Job growth, wages actually were rising. As of January 2020, wages were rising faster for lower income people than they were for higher income people, right? So you were actually starting to get a reinvigoration of wage growth, right? Which is what you get when you get a productivity boom. And so it was quite literally like the best economy we've had in maybe forever. In January 2020, it was great. And then of course, COVID arrives, right? And exactly to your point, like I was like, like a lot of people, I just got totally freaked out by COVID early on. And in part was like, oh my God, we're going to voluntarily, we're going to take basically the best economy we've ever had, that, by the way, completely disproves all these Luddite theories. And we're going to kill it. Like, we're going to voluntarily kill it because we're going to shut it down because we're going to go into these lockdowns, and we're going to, and basically, right, from an economic standpoint, the lockdowns, basically, it's a simultaneous killing of the demand side of the economy because you're telling people they have to stay home and they can't spend money. And it's a killing of the supply side of the economy, which is you're shutting down all the factories, right? All the production capabilities. And so I was like, basically, oh my God, like Great Depression 2.0, like, this is going to be a real problem. To your point, it turned out, right? Well, part of what happened obviously was just like mass government subsidies, a huge, printing of trillions of dollars and all these new social benefits. Basically, we've been piloting UBI, at least in the U.S. But yeah, look, part of what happened was basically all of these online forms of activity basically got shoved forward by, I think as much as a decade. Right. And so all of a sudden you have this massive share shift, from, offline, from retail stores that could not be open. All of a sudden, e-commerce, you have this massive share shift from schools to online, kind of physical classrooms to online education. You have this massive share shift from commercial office space to, teleconferencing. And yeah, the consequences of the true long-term consequences of this period may have much less to do with the health issues. It may have much more to do with the economic transformation that this has really accelerated.
And do you think, let's talk a little about the politics, go back to the politics. So there's always a sense that Silicon Valley and the digital revolution, all these things, I mean, precisely because they are moving the focus away from, factories, organized labor, all those kinds of things, that they are a force for kind of libertarianism and sort of anti-state, tech companies don't want governments interfering with them. They sort of create that sense that you're the agent, you're not, you sitting in front of the screen, you're the master of your own destiny and so on. Do you think that's true? Do you think in the future, as we move more online and as tech plays a bigger and bigger role in our lives, that we will become more libertarian and we will become in a sense more, well, I mean, it's a silly way of referring to it, but more right wing in that way?
Yeah, so start by saying is there's a certain truth to the theory, and that certain truth is, there is a libertarian wing to the tech industry, and there has been for a very long time. In our time, it's been, kind of around, this, my friend Peter Thiel, who's become, kind of one of these great American characters, who's just an absolute genius and is very inspirational for a lot of people, but is sort of famously a libertarian and kind of has a culture that kind of orbits around him of libertarianism. And so, there is that, there is that component. Just in reality, though, basically, like it's a fringe of the politics of the Valley, at least the American tech industry. Overwhelmingly, the American tech industry is sort of what you just call classic, just progressive liberal.
Right.
And you can see this, by the way, very clearly in the numbers. You can see this in the voting patterns in the Bay Area, and you can see it in the political donations. Like you take the typical big tech company, or any cluster of people in Silicon Valley. You take the entrepreneurs would be the same way, or the venture capital firms would be the same way. It's like during the 2016 cycle, it's like 97% of the money or something went to Hillary Clinton. Right. And 0.0001% went to Donald Trump.
And Donald Trump is not on Twitter anymore.
Right. Exactly. Well, now Trump was not libertarian, but it is no, for all of the gnashing of the teeth around, the tech industry and Trump, Peter was the only, tech donor to Donald Trump. Like he was, N of one. But then look, there's like a little scattering, you'll see a little scattering of money to Rand Paul or something, or to whoever the libertarian candidate was in 2016, but it's really on the margin. It's almost entirely the standard liberal progressive Democrat. And I think the reason for that, it's a very prosaic explanation, which is kind of almost too boring to talk about, which is just the tech industry is composed of people who are kind of highly educated, they're highly open, and they're very socially progressive, exactly as you'd expect from any sort of elite knowledge industry in the modern era. And they have overwhelmingly the exact politics of their peers in the entertainment industry or in the finance industry or in any of these other sort of knowledge work industries, architects and graphic designers, and it's all the same. So it's overwhelmingly standard leftism. And I don't really see any signs that if anything, that's intensifying. If anything, the Valley's going further left.
I mean, I wonder if it's even more fundamental than that. I mean, you were talking about, books, how amazing it would have been for the first time to read a book. And there's a famous passage in one of Plato's dialogues where he describes the Egyptian god Thoth coming to the pharaoh and saying, "Look, I've invented writing." And Pharaoh's absolutely appalled. this is going to have a devastating effect. We're not going to have it. And it's evident that, that Plato basically kind of agrees with this, because Plato's a massive conservative, even though, of course, he's writing it down. And there is a sense, isn't there, that, in every great convulsive period of change, there are people whose instinct is to say, this is going to be terrible. This is going to be for the worst. Why can't things just stay the way they are? And then there are others who say, yes, this is incredible. This has, amazing opportunities. And I would guess, you're looking at what you've written about it, that you're absolutely someone who thinks, yeah, that, this is great. Your dreams in the 90s, I guess, have pretty much been fulfilled, haven't they?
Yeah. So look, I guess I'd say more than anything else, I had this conversation with Andy Grove once years ago, and he's, talking about the impacts of new technology, and he's, to a certain extent, he just kind of waved the topic away. And I was like, I can't believe you're not, I was like, I can't believe you're not more interested in this. Like, you're the chip guy. Like, you must think about the consequences of these. And he basically said, he's like, look, it's like, once new technology arrives, like, it's like, it's like, like sort of writing, or like steel. Like, one day we don't have steel, the next day we have steel. Right. Or by the way, one day we don't have nuclear weapons, the next day we have nuclear weapons. Like, the primary thing that happens is, okay, it's here. Right. Like, to some extent, these debates are actually not useful, or at least he viewed them as not useful, because it's like, it's here. It's not, you're never going backwards. Like, you're never putting the genie back in the bottle. And so, it's just like air. Now you have air. Congratulations. Right. Like, everybody's going to breathe. There's no debate. Like, it's just going to happen. Right. And so, there's an extent to which it's just simply like, this technology, once people figure out, kind of what's possible and they build it, you don't put it back in the bottle. Now, if you're not an engineer, that sounds a little bit insane. It sounds a little bit like engineers kind of think that they're just kind of on autopilot. They should just build whatever they want. They don't bear more responsibility for anything. My big counter argument to that would be, I think engineers have a terrible track record of predicting both the negative and the positive consequences of their new technologies. My favorite example of that was Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison invented the phonograph. And he was completely convinced, as a proper, God-fearing wasp of his generation, he was completely convinced that the killer app for the phonograph was going to be to reinforce, existing religions, because people would finally be able to have their own home libraries of sermons.
That would appeal to you, Tom.
on wax records. And of course, to him, it was the most natural thing in the world. You'd put in a hard day's work in the factory. You'd come home at night, you'd have dinner, and then you'd put on a sermon, and the family would sit around and listen to the sermon. Right. And so it turns out people didn't want that. It turns out they wanted this, very evil devil music called jazz. Right. Yeah. So, the technologists have I don't know that the technologists have any sort of real track record of predicting consequences. I don't know that the non-technologists have a very good, record of predicting the consequences of new technology. Technology is, by the very nature, it is just a tool. It is, human beings who decide how to use everything.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever been able to figure out how to put anything back in the box. And then I think, look, with the really big ones, I think you've got good and bad, right? I think you've got the good and bad. I always think about nuclear weapons, right? It's like, nuclear weapons, like, of all the technologies you think maybe we should not have built as a species, maybe nuclear weapons would be that thing. But it's like, maybe, we're 75 years in now, and, we haven't had World War III. Yeah. And, maybe the existence of nuclear weapons, it means that 1 billion people who would have died in a conventional World War III in the 1970s or something, didn't die. And so maybe they've actually kept the peace this whole time. And so,
But Mark,
yeah.
On the topic of World War III, could I just ask you about China?
Sure.
And has China kind of emancipated itself from basically Silicon Valley? Has its control of the internet enabled it to stand clear of that? And is that a threat to the Silicon Valley based internet that we have in the West?
Well, I think there's two parts of that. We can talk about either one. So one is just like the actual Chinese tech industry, and to what extent is it able to function kind of independently of the U.S. And then the other question is that I think you're asking is more around the Great Firewall, sort of the Chinese ability to kind of harness the internet and restrict its impact.
And I suppose also to use the internet to attack the West, because you don't need nuclear weapons if you can use hackers or whatever to kind of disable, I don't know, power stations in the US. I mean, that would be something that tech has made possible in a way that simply wouldn't have been possible kind of 40 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. So there is this concept. It's sort of, sometimes hear the term network-centric warfare, kind of, irregular warfare happening online. There is this. This is something I've talked to people in Washington about. There's so-called doctrines of war, right? So there's military planners, right, in any big country have all these theories about basically what counts as a military attack, what counts as an act of war, what retaliations happen, like if they shoot down one of our jet fighters, what do we do? right? And at what point does it go from a kind of a skirmish to a war and so forth? Leading all the way up to and including nuclear strikes. As of right now, to my knowledge, there's no doctrine of war for what you might call online warfare, right? And so, the Russians hack this, the Chinese hack that, this, that, the other thing, whatever, IRS records, voting machines, power plants, hospitals, who's behind all these ransomware attacks, where are they being launched from, somebody, trialing those, and so forth and so on. And at least right now, I get the sense that this is a very fuzzy topic. In the sense that, like, it was supposed to say, nobody in DC has been able to answer the question for me of X, Y, and Z happen online, and it therefore results in real world military retaliation. Like that, that doctrine literally doesn't exist. Now, I would bucket this in with just this more general concept of irregular warfare, which is basically sort of non-traditional warfare. Aimed at basically, so in the old days, it would have been like, sabotage, right, as an example. Now, the optimist in me basically says, if we're arguing about irregular warfare, we're in pretty good shape, right? Because you'd much rather sit around and worry about irregular warfare than regular warfare. So I think probably this means we're doing okay.
Okay, fair enough. But what? Here's a question, a slightly odd question. So obviously in this podcast, most of the time we look backwards, and I'm sort of conscious that most of the things that we use this new technology for are things that we kind of predicted we'd use it for back in the 1980s. So, you buy things from your computer screen, you talk to your friends, you exchange ideas, you read the newspaper online. I mean, people were saying we would do that one day, in 1975 or 1980. What's coming though? I mean, what's next that we haven't foreseen, or that people like me and Tom, who don't know anything about technology, haven't foreseen? Where do you think we're going with this?
Yeah, so the thing that just keeps surprising me over and over again, and this is where I'm trying to spend a lot of time trying to figure this out right now, in our day job, it's the internet as an enabler and a catalyst for movements, right? Like social movements, right? And I would go so far as to say probably the right term is cults. Right. And we talked about this a little bit with the politics conversation that we talked, but I would just say more in general, you just see it's just that the things I've just been shocked by routinely. I forget if the press is much over there, but this whole thing with GameStop, and this big stock market kind of thing that happened like 6 months ago, where basically this basically crew of like random people on Reddit got together and basically just creamed the living hell out of these hedge funds. What you just see now basically is like these incredible movements. Well, and you mentioned woke. Like woke is another one of these, right? Woke is this like very powerful, energized internet movement, right?
QAnon would be part of that as well.
Yeah, exactly. So QAnon. So there's been this concept in the gaming industry for many years called the augmented reality game, ARG. And it's this idea that you'll have games that basically play out in a hybrid of like basically a virtual environment, but also in the real world. And there have been these like ARGs over the years that people have built where it's like basically it's like there's this one game where you basically get to be a spy, and like you get a call at your desk at 3 PM, and you have to go pick up whatever the secret package is, this or that, take this and that, and then there's secret emails you have to decrypt and so forth. And so they try to kind of immerse you in this kind of fantasy, kind of half virtual, half real kind of fantasy. So the ARGs never went mainstream. Like that, nobody ever was able to figure out the formula to actually have these things take as compared to just a video game. In technical terms, QAnon is the first mass ARG. Right. Like somebody's running this thing. And there are theories now as to who it is, but like somebody's running this thing, and it, quite literally, to your point, like it's an online phenomenon that then literally jumped out, and now you see it present at every, basically at there's certain kinds of political rallies and so forth where you're in certain places in the country where it's very prominent. And so that's a great example. And I think it's it's this. I mean, if you wanted to get kind of really kind of say pseudo profound, look, you could kind of say, look, kind of modern, Western culture, capitalism, so forth, right? The standard critique is it kind of, atomized, eliminated a lot of the historical connections that people feel to kind of family or tribe, right? Or society or culture. And, it may be that people have been basically looking for meaning, traditional religion has been collapsing. And so there's this meaning void in people's lives. And like, if you want meaning, you can almost certainly find it somewhere online.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's pseudo profound at all. I think that's exactly what's happening. That people find community, cohesion, a sense of purpose, a sense of who's on your side, who you need to hate. I mean, they get all that online, don't they?
Yeah, I think so. I think increasingly that's the case. We're actually seeing it in business. Like I would say that, like, I'll just give you an example. Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin. I say Bitcoin is a movement, right? And there's just like this. Well, I'll just give you an example. Like there's this attempt recently. Washington's trying to figure out what to do with all this stuff all the time. So they attach this Bitcoin basically legislation to this whatever this big infrastructure package they're doing. And there was this mass uprising of all of the Bitcoin aficionados, right, in the U.S. who were like, wait a minute, like you can't do that. Like this is our thing. You can't take it away. Or Tesla, I think, is another one of these stories, right? Where is like, is Tesla a car company or is it a global, sort of science, movement, to save the planet? Where the way that you participate in the movement is you follow Elon Musk, you hang on his every word, and you proselytize his gospel, and then by the way, you buy the car and you buy the stock. And Tesla, I don't know if this is still the case, but there was a point not that long ago when Tesla's stock was worth more than every other global car company combined. Right. Yeah. And like, why would that be? Well, maybe it's because Tesla's going to just like be the best, car company of all time, which is certainly possible. But maybe it's just because like people aren't just buying its stock because they like the financials of the company. Maybe it's part of being the movement. And by the way, maybe that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Maybe the fact that Elon has such a movement, there's no movement behind Ford, right? There used to be, like 100 years ago, Henry Ford was the leader of a movement, but like Ford Motor Company today, there's no movement. In Toyota, there's no movement, but Tesla, there's a movement.
So right? Apple remains a kind of movement.
I was about to say Apple, or Coca-Cola, or Levi's, or McDonald's, especially in the the Eastern Bloc or something. I mean, they were signifiers of political meaning and stuff.
Yeah, but Apple, I mean, it almost died in the 90s, didn't it? And then it kind of. It like a kind of expanding empire. It recovered and annexed music and film and TV and phones and everything. And I mean, I would say that's the kind of the classic example, and that's why is it still the largest company in the world? I mean, it seems to be. Yeah, I mean,
it is. And by the way, the guy, Steve came down from the mountain with a tablet.
Yeah, he did. Well, I think that's probably
and the tablet will tell you exactly what to believe.
Yeah, buy another Apple product is generally what it's saying.
Exactly.
Mark, I think that's the perfect note on which to end. Can't thank you enough for this.
Fantastic.
It's been a blast, and
thank you very much, Mark.
As Dominic says, normally we spend the time looking backwards, but it's been very energizing to look forwards as well. So the rest is the future.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to The Rest is History. For bonus episodes, early access, ad-free listening, and access to our chat community, please sign up at restishistorypod.com. That's restishistorypod.com.